Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. This month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives will provide fresh information and insights into the crisis in Venezuela. Venezuela is a sovereign nation, a strong democracy on the northern coast of South America. Increasingly in recent years, the U.S. government has been causing a crisis in Venezuela. The U.S. government and mainstream media have been misrepresenting what caused the crisis and how to resolve it. The people of the United States have the right and the responsibility to understand and to shape U.S. foreign policy. We're conducting this interview on Thursday, March 14, 2019. When you watch the program, it will be later, but even if the news has changed by the time that you watch this interview, the information that we will share during this hour will help you understand the background and the context, and our information will help you take positive actions to help solve the problems. I'm happy that during this hour, Larry Mosqueda will be sharing his knowledge and insights about Venezuela and Latin America. Dr. Larry Mosqueda has taught political science and political economy for over 40 years, including the last 30 years at the Evergreen State College in Olympia. He is now Professor Emeritus. In addition to teaching and research, he's been a human rights and solidarity activist with groups such as the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPAS, for almost 40 years. He has served as an international election observer many times. He's traveled to Venezuela in 2012, and he has been closely monitoring the situation there and U.S. intervention both before and after that 2012 trip. I've also enjoyed having Dr. Mosqueda as my guest for several TV interviews over the years because his knowledge is broad and deep, and he is skilled at explaining things clearly so ordinary people can understand. We will do that again during this interview as we discuss Venezuela and the context for the current crisis. Thank you for being here, Larry.
Thank you.
Good to have you here.
Thank you.
And it'll be interesting for the viewers, too. They'll get stuff that they're not getting elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that's what this program is all about.
Well, thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thank you. Before we explore the specifics, can you just give us a little bit of context and background that led to the current crisis in Venezuela?
Okay, well, the current crisis is basically, as you know, is that the Trump administration is trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela, the Maduro government. And so basically a month ago in January, about January 23, the United States recognized Guaido as the president of Venezuela, and he's not. He's actually just a legislator in the National Assembly. Yeah. And he had a conversation with Vice President Pence the day before, literally. And this is actually public knowledge that our government was actually proud of. And so there's a crisis right now in the sense that the United States is trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela.
Yeah, the government that's a legitimate democracy with President Maduro.
Who was elected in 2018 and also 2000. 13 and also re-elected.
Yeah, and Venezuela has an experience of free and fair elections historically, unless we mess with them.
Yeah.
So we need to see this current interaction between the U.S. and Latin America within the context really of a history that goes back for centuries.
Right.
Almost 200 years ago, in 1823, U.S. President Monroe unilaterally declared that Latin America was in the U.S.'s exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine asserted a sense of entitlement, really, that the United States could do whatever we want in Latin America, and Europe just had to stay the heck out. That was ours to mess around with. And that's really what the Monroe Doctrine is. It has no legitimate standing, no basis in international law. It's just a unilateral power claim by the U.S. over Latin America.
Right. Remember, Latin America was a colony of the whole colony of Spain, the Spanish Empire.
Yeah, except Portugal had Brazil.
But between 1810 and 1820, the people of Latin America rose up against Spain.
Yeah.
And so you had all these independent countries. So by 1823, then President Monroe had the Monroe Doctrine. And that was actually a message to Great Britain, telling them, we're going to take over Latin America.
Yeah.
So it had nothing to do with protecting the people of Latin America.
Right.
It had everything to do with saying, this is part of our empire. This is going to be part of our empire.
Yeah, and as we see throughout the history since then, the U.S. has been meddling, and we'll cover some of that later on during this hour. The history of the past 2 centuries includes a lot of U.S. intervention, and it's both economic, like colonial, not really a formal colony, but like economic colonialism, and military.
Well, colonialism, like in Puerto Rico, actually establishing dictatorships in places like Cuba and also Central America and other places in Latin America. Yeah. In fact, part of my research for this particular program, I was reading the work of John Pilger, who's an internationally known journalist and researcher, and he pointed out that if the United States succeeds in overthrowing the government of Venezuela this time, it'll be the 68th overthrow of a government around the world.
Yeah.
And many of them in Latin America and some are other places around the world.
And some have been democracies, and I want to mention some of those later on in the hour, because it's not like the United States, out of the goodness of our heart, are overthrowing dictatorships and installing democracies.
It's the other way around.
It's the opposite. Yeah, we overthrow democracies and then install dictators that will be subservient to U.S. business and political interests. And it's just a long history. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Honduras 2009, and a brief attempt in Venezuela in 2002.
2002.
Yeah. So Venezuela really has a long history of free and fair elections, and I don't remember the exact wording, but Jimmy Carter, who's done a lot of election monitoring, said something about like Venezuela's elections are really the best in terms of fairness. I don't recall the exact wording.
Yeah, from the year 2002 to basically the present time, one of the things the Carter Center has been doing is actually sort of visiting different countries. In fact, I was not with them, but I was actually the same time that they were in Nicaragua back in 1990. But one of the things that Jimmy Carter said, they had the best structure. He doesn't always like who's elected, but they have the best. There's no voting fraud. There's no there's no manipulation of ballots, et cetera.
Yeah. And you don't have to agree with the outcome as long as the process is fair. It's up to the people to decide. Yeah. And that's something that the United States doesn't quite get.
Yeah.
It's the people in a democracy. The people get to decide, even if they make a decision that our government thinks is not wise.
Yeah, well, that's part of being the empire. The United States is an empire for the region, is that it doesn't want places in the outreaches in the periphery of the empire to actually have people to have democracy. In fact, the purpose of American foreign policy is not to have democracy, but to have control.
Yeah. Now, so Venezuela has honest, free, fair elections, and the people of Venezuela elected Hugo Chavez to become president. The election was in December '98. He took office in 1999, and he accomplished a huge amount of good things from 1999 until he died in 2013. Can you summarize some of the good things that Hugo Chavez did as elected president of Venezuela?
I visited there in 2012, so I saw some of this for myself. But actually, just as importantly, I've been doing a lot of research on other people I have around the world. And what he did was actually sort of use the oil money, because Venezuela is an oil state.
Yeah. In fact, they have the world's largest, I just read this yesterday again, as of now, they have the world's largest amount of proven oil reserves.
Right, exactly.
They're number one. Saudi Arabia is number 2. The U.S. is number 10.
Yeah. So he used some of the money from selling that basically to improve education, improve healthcare, improve nutrition for the people of the area, especially from 1999 to 2013.
Yeah.
Now there have been problems in the area, but basically he was using the money in a very productive way for the population.
Because the oil is under their ground, the people's ground.
Right.
It's a public resource, and Chavez was wise enough and compassionate enough to use it, and accountable enough to use the people's resource to serve the needs of the population.
Right. In fact, one of the problems that existed, I think, in the 2000s was that he didn't save enough money didn't build enough reserves for cash. So he was using the money actually for the population, which is great, but also it's like saving for retirement. You should actually save for retirement and also save some money. So that's why there's some part of the crisis right now, not because of corruption per se, although there is corruption because there's corruption everywhere, is that the part of the process is that there's not enough cash reserves. But the United States does the same thing. We hardly have any cash reserves. In fact, but one of the things about the United States is that we can print our money, and the American dollar is the currency around the world.
And people don't realize this when other countries get into financial problems, they're not as free to print money because the world economy functions on the dollar.
Right.
And so U.S. can just print some, but Venezuela is not free to print its way out of debt.
No, in fact, they can't because in the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement around 1942-43, the United States made with the Allied powers the American dollar the currency of the planet. So if somebody's selling something from Pakistan to India, neither one of them want the other person's money. They want American dollars for selling products. And so the United States can print all the money it wants, but Venezuela can print money, but it's not particularly valuable.
Right, and the debts, when these other countries end up with debts to the International Monetary Fund or World Bank or somebody, those debts end up being in American dollars. So
they have to be paid back
they're
in dollars.
trapped
Right.
in debt. And people don't realize that. So these other countries that are having economic problems, in some cases are not problems of their own making, just because of the way the global economy functions.
In fact, most of these countries, I think, cannot really solve their problems independently. I'm not saying everything's perfect, but they can't solve them independently because the dominant empire won't allow them to do that. So the American economy from World War II, both Democrats and Republicans have been not helpful to the rest of the people on the planet.
And people in this country don't see that, but people in the other countries are painfully aware of what those realities are. So the United States supported a coup in 2002 that briefly overthrew Venezuela's democracy and removed Chavez. Overwhelmingly, the public supported Chavez, and in just 47 hours, the people brought him back. Can you tell us about that experience?
Literally 2 days. It was a weekend coup, and literally in 2 days, the people overthrew the coup makers. And actually, if people want to take a look at, there's a very good movie called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised."
Yes.
And it's available on YouTube, so anybody can watch it anytime they want. Because it's about 15 years old, the movie. But basically, what occurred then was that the American government, in conclusion with different elements in the oligarchy and also some elements in the military, overthrew Chavez and took him off to an island. But then the people in the streets literally rose up and forced the government that was the coup government to actually give up. And also, you see this in the movie, Chavez actually anticipated that the coup might occur. So the palace guard, which is still the guard that was protecting him before, then actually turned on the coup makers. So it was quite a brilliant work on his part.
And it was fun. I saw the movie a number of years ago. It was really fun. They happened to be there.
Right.
And there's this great slogan, the revolution will not be televised. But in this case, they did televise. And because the TV, the filmmaking crew happened to be there, and they could monitor what was going on.
And that's why it's a really great documentary, because most documentaries, have either scripts or have sort of interviews, et cetera.
Reconstructed after the fact.
But these guys were a couple Irish guys, just happened to be there. They were doing a documentary anyway, and they were in the middle of the coup in the palace when all this is going on.
Live in real time.
And it feels like a Hollywood film when you're watching it, but it's a documentary.
And people should check that out. But again, it showed the public support for Hugo Chavez. They brought it back in 47 hours. And because the Venezuelan people really supported the democracy, even though it was the oligarchy, the elite, the economic elite, that wanted to.
Yeah, who are working with the CIA and working with the American government.
Yeah.
Remember, this is 2002. So this now is 2019.
Yeah.
So there's 17 years of history that we have in documentation. There's a very good book by Ava Gollinger called the Chavez Code, in which she actually sort of goes through the American documents that actually prove the American complicity in the coup. So it's not just conjecture.
Yeah, and that was the George W. Bush era.
Yeah.
But as we'll mention a couple times during this interview, the foreign policy of the U.S. is very much bipartisan.
Right.
It almost doesn't matter who's in the White House because it's the same stuff happening.
It's the same general direction because it is part of, again, the empire. One of the classes I teach is called the political economy of empire and geography of empire.
Yeah.
So I make this sort of reference.
So the U.S. has been causing trouble to Venezuela for decades, and this was true under George W. Bush, like when the 2002 coup occurred. Obama kept the pressure on.
Yeah, I mentioned the sanctions, and actually the first sanctions were in the most recent 20 years was George W. Bush, the second guy. And then this next sanctions were under Obama in 2015, in which he actually made sort of put the screws on Venezuela. And of course the last year with the Trump administration, 2017 and 18.
So it's a recurring pattern, and these other aspects in Latin American intervention and meddling of various kinds, it goes all the way back. It's just like the Vietnam goes from decades on.
In fact, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that, again, sort of doing research for interviews and also doing research for my teaching, is that all of these activities the United States engages in is actually bases on American lies, like the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin, which did not occur,
right? And
then the weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein, which did not exist. The throwing babies out of incubators by Saddam Hussein, that did not exist. And now we're being told a pack of lies on a daily basis.
Yeah, it is that recurring pattern, and it doesn't matter who's in charge. I remember, like you mentioned, Gulf of Tonkin, that was the prompt for Vietnam. I remember watching Robert McNamara on TV telling about this thing, and it turned out that North Vietnam did not fire on this U.S. ship. We were in their territorial waters, and we're and all these things are just case after case after case.
Yeah, in fact, that's actually one of, like when you mentioned McNamara, when I use the word lies, I'm not saying that these people were mistaken, they were goodwill, but they were actually telling things which they believed not to be true.
Yeah, they knew that
they knew that they were lying.
They knew that.
In fact, there's another very good movie by Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower.
Yeah.
And he points out the title of the movie is "The Most Dangerous Man in America," which is the title Kissinger gave him.
Yeah.
And he was an associate of McNamara, and he was briefing McNamara of what was going on in Vietnam. And then he saw McNamara lie when Ellsberg is a young man standing right by him, and Ellsberg said, "I hope I'm never in a position where I need to lie like that," because he knew his boss was McNamara. He was lying.
Just a few weeks ago, I read Daniel Ellsberg's new book, his 2017 or 2018 book, The Doomsday Machine, about nuclear weapons. And he goes back into the late 50s, and he was very high up and could speak with anybody, and he knew all the lies about nuclear weapons from then. And then he was interacting with McNamara and all these high up people, and the responsible people did not know what was going on. Other people were messing things up, and he was saying, "Do you know about this?" "Oh no, nobody ever told me about that." And so I mean, he had a long history going back to the late 50s and the Eisenhower era and Kennedy and beyond. So I recommend Daniel Ellsberg's The Doomsday Machine. The Timberland Library System has it here. That's where I borrowed it. Some of the people who have long histories of causing horrible violence and injustice throughout Latin America have worked for Ronald Reagan, the older George Bush, and now they're working for Trump in high levels of power. And I want to name a couple of these people and see if you could give us something about each of them. I'll mention three. I'll mention John Bolton, Elliott Abrams, and Mike Pompeo. Pompeo had come out of Congress.
Kansas.
But John Bolton.
Well, John Bolton has been a national security advisor since he said the term on Ronald Reagan. And he was one of the people who was directly involved with Central America and also with the war in Iraq. and he was actually he's the guy with the mustache.
Yeah.
And he's been involved in really criminal activity for the last 30 years, and he is if you take a look at his record, he's actually a very vicious person. But even a more vicious individual person is Elliott Abrams. Elliott Abrams had hands-on activity with the Reagan administration in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and also throughout his entire career. In fact, Elliott Abrams was actually brought before Congress to testify about his activities in Nicaragua and Central America, and he lied to Congress about his activities, and he's convicted of perjury about lying to Congress. Then he's pardoned by George W. Bush for it. So he's actually a convicted war criminal.
Yeah.
And when I say convicted war criminal, the type of things that Abrams would be involved with, and the reason we're talking about Abrams is because Abrams is actually Trump's man on Venezuela. He was appointed a couple of weeks ago. And so Abrams was actually, during the Central American era of the 1980s, he would justify and actually help to direct people like Rios Montt of Guatemala, who's actually involved in murdering people of Guatemala.
The dictator of
Guatemala. And also with the Contra War against Nicaragua in the 1980s.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that Elliott Abrams was doing during the 1980s was sending in what he called, because he's actually involved in the office of, quote, this Orwellian human rights. So he's actually involved with sending down shipments of, quote, humanitarian aids, which is actually military shipments. And so the most recent shipment that you saw in Venezuela that the American government, Trump, said we're trying to send humanitarian aid, that was actually under Elliott Abrams also. So he's actually used the Trojan horse before.
Yeah.
So he's actually a very vicious person. Pompeo, the current Secretary of State, was actually the head of the CIA before he became Secretary of State. Before that, he was a congressman from Kansas. So he's a very right-wing individual. Take a look at his history.
Yeah.
And so you got CIA person, you got the Secretary of State person, and today's what, as you mentioned on the early beginning of the show, the 14th, and I read an article from Vanity Fair today, which basically said that Pompeo might be thinking about running for president in next election if Trump goes down. And so it's because he's in Iowa too. And what's the Secretary of State going to do, and why is he going to Iowa?
So you mentioned a moment ago, you mentioned the Contra War in Nicaragua. And if for people who are either too young or not remembering, Nicaragua had a progressive government.
Right.
The Sandinista Party was doing all kinds of really wonderful things, promoting literacy and healthcare, and all kinds of good stuff for Nicaragua. And of course, that offended the Reagan administration, and the CIA under Reagan created an actual terrorist group, who are the counter-revolutionaries. In Spanish, it becomes Contra.
Right.
So the Contras were an actual terrorist group created and funded by the CIA
and the American government
and the U.S. government to commit horrible crimes against people who are teaching literacy or helping.
Yeah, in fact, what the CIA talked about, the people who are teachers and farmers, they talked about them as soft targets.
Yes.
Soft target is a term where you're killing civilian population.
Yeah.
And that's what the American government was doing in the 1980s.
Yeah.
In fact, I think the year was 1986. The Reagan administration was actually convicted in the World Court, The Hague, of war crimes because of their activities in Nicaragua.
Right. And Reagan said, I just don't accept the World Court's jurisdiction.
Yeah, because who's going to enforce it?
That was his response. So it shows the contempt for law and justice at the highest level. But that was Elliott Abrams' involvement.
Yeah.
So I mean, these people go way back, and Trump has pulled them out of their crevices,
bowels of hell,
and plunked them in. This is scary stuff.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is it's not just the same policies; it's the same people.
Yeah,
it's the same people who are in charge, and that's why they're picking these people, because they know how to kill civilian
They've got a track record, and it's a real rogues gallery. So the current crisis in Venezuela was contrived by various people, but the fairly elected president, Nicolas Maduro, is being blamed as if he somehow screwed things up. And he's not perfect. He's made some mistakes as the president of the country, in terms of management and stuff. But he was duly elected in 2018 in an election that was free and fair. Maduro won an honest election. He has the constitutional right to serve his term as president. And what can you tell us about the crisis involving Juan Guaido, who's an upstart who just claims to be president.
Yeah, well, Juan Guaido was, in January of this year, 2019, he was the head of the National Assembly. The National Assembly was voted in 2015, and actually they were, there was one of the few times where the opposition parties actually beat the Socialist Party of the Chavistas, but in a reasonably fair election at that time, and so they took power, which is one of the indications that it's not a dictatorship, because dictators don't lose elections. Dictators do not lose elections.
And they also don't put up with having the National Assembly of an opposition party.
Yeah, and so what ends up happening is that the National Assembly, were engaged in all types of things to subvert the government of Maduro.
Because it was the other party.
Because of the other party. But very sort of subversive type activity. And Supreme Court of Venezuela, kept ruling against them, and finally they dissolved the National Assembly because they're basically engaged in illegal activities, which they had the right to do. And then Maduro called the national election for the national for Constituent Assembly, which actually sort of then rewrote the Constitution and helped things come along. And then so the National Assembly was still existing out there somewhere in the ether. And so Guaido was not elected to anything in any real sense. He was actually, because the parties that were in the National Assembly had a rotating leadership.
Yeah.
And he just happened to be the leader at that particular time, so he swore himself in. It'd be like literally like Nancy Pelosi saying that, well, I'm going to become president because Trump did not get the popular vote. Well, whatever we think about Trump, and I'm not a fan of Trump, obviously.
Yeah.
Whatever you think about Trump, the electoral college system as it works, actually, he's the president right now.
Yeah.
And Nancy Pelosi can't do it. And then it'd be like having China trying to enforce Nancy Pelosi upon the people of the United States. Yeah. So it becomes insanity. In fact, so most of the world does not recognize what's going on in Venezuela.
If we took these kinds of examples like what you did, here's an analogy, you can see how ridiculous it was. And I emailed our U.S. senators and told them that you need to stand up and support democracy. And I want to tell you what Maria Cantwell said. I've got to find it here. I'm not going to see it in my notes, but what she said basically was, I said, you've got to stop this stuff. This is a coup. Yeah. It's illegal. It has no constitutional basis for Maduro to be kicked out by Guaido, who had no real constitutional validity. And it's a coup. You got to stop this. And Cantwell's response to me by email was, thank you for writing me about the leadership dispute in Venezuela. She called it a leadership dispute. Yeah, so the example that you gave of Nancy Pelosi said, Trump's out of here, I'm in charge now. This is not just a leadership dispute. That's a real coup.
Yeah, it's a coup going on that's imposed by the United States.
Yeah.
In fact, again, I want to repeat that Vice President Pence actually told Guaido the day before to declare himself president. And the reason we know that is because it's on national TV in the United States.
Yes.
So what's going on right now is not just the old coups of 1954 in Guatemala and Dominican Republic 65, but the American government is actually sort of just laying out what we're trying to do. But most Americans don't really have, including Cantwell, have an idea of American history or what's going on.
It's blatant, and that's why I'm glad that we've got this context within our history of this. The coup is being promoted by Venezuela's elites. They have certainly a business elite that doesn't want to lose power by having fairness for poor people and public health and stuff like that. So the coup is being promoted by Venezuela's elites and by U.S. politicians and oil companies, and we'll talk about oil in a moment, and the mainstream media. They're promoting propaganda that tries to justify the coup. And I wonder if you could just mention what some of the propaganda points are and why those propaganda points are not valid.
Well, part of the propaganda point is that Maduro is not duly elected, but that's actually just false. He was duly elected.
Yeah.
And also that Maduro is not popular because of the economic crisis. And actually he has some lack of popularity. His approval rating, I've seen a lot of the polls coming out of Venezuela, is about 30%. Guaido's is about 20-25%.
Yeah.
In fact, Maduro's 35% is actually about 10 points higher than the president of France right now.
Yeah, that's right.
So we shouldn't have a coup in France, and we shouldn't have a coup in...
Right.
So essentially that Maduro is actually a dictator. He's not. He's an elected president. And sometimes people think he's authoritarian. Well, he is and he isn't. If he's a little bit authoritarian to the people who are trying to overthrow the government, which is what any politician would do around the world, but he's not authoritarian to the population as a whole. Plus, I've seen a lot of the videos that are coming out of Venezuela in the last month, because you've seen the videos on our TV, American TV, of these protests that are going on, which are anti-Maduro. And I've seen some of those, and I've looked up on the on YouTube on different sources. And there are some anti-Maduro protests, but if you take a look at the population, they tend to be upper class, upper middle class, and very white. If you take a look at the pro-Maduro rallies, which are actually larger than the anti-Maduro rallies, they tend to be people who are much darker and much poorer. So there's a class and race division going on. And John Pilger, who's actually has been in Venezuela quite a bit, points this out, and so does Max Blumenthal.
People keep saying that Maduro has mismanaged Venezuela's economy, and therefore we need to kick him out. The damage to the economy was caused by U.S. sanctions. Tell us a bit.
The sanctions actually, again, sort of, the first ones that were in 2006, I believe, by President Bush, Bush II, and then 2015 by President Obama, and then the most recent, of course, by President Trump last year, and also he's thinking about doing more. Those sanctions, according to the studies I've seen, have actually cost Venezuela an incredible amount of money. In fact, the last year they cost $6 billion, estimates I've seen. For this year, the projection is $11 billion, and another $10 billion approximately of damage to the economy, and about another $1.2 billion of gold that the American government and the English are not allowing, Venezuelan gold, not allowing to go back. So it's about over $25 billion worth of money that actually is Venezuela's money. So there is an economic crisis in Venezuela, but it's caused primarily by the sanctions. But I would point out that it does not mean that Maduro did a perfect job of manipulating things any more than President Nixon did, or President Johnson did, or any other president did. But he's not, he hasn't stole all the money or something like that.
It's a difference between having a policy difference versus having actual corruption. And this guy does not seem to be corrupt. He's just made some mistakes, but the bulk of the problems to their economy were caused by the U.S. and related people. The U.S., the economic sanctions were trying to destroy their economy, and this little bit of supposedly humanitarian aid is about 1/1000th of. It was like $23 million, whereas we've done about 24 billion of damage to it. So it's like 1/1000th of it. So it was just a PR stunt by Trump to.
In fact, a UN rapporteur who's actually sort of studying Venezuela pointed out
from the United Nations.
From the United Nations. He essentially said that the sanctions are essentially a war crime, because what they're engaged in is actually hurting the people of Venezuela, not just hurting sort of a little bit, but sort of killing people.
And this economic disruption, the destabilization, deliberate screwing up of their economy reminds me of what the U.S. did to Chile, what Nixon and Kissinger did to Chile, because Chile had elected a socialist, Salvador Allende, and the people loved what he was doing. He was doing things to help Chile. And Chile had the longest running democracy in Latin America since the 1800s, a continuous democracy, longest running democracy. And Nixon and Kissinger and Chile's business people and some U.S. corporations and the military overthrew their democracy and installed General Pinochet, this brutal dictator.
In fact, that was the actual plan of the Nixon administration. Nixon and Kissinger, in fact, their policy was, quote, to make the economy scream.
That was
Make the economy scream.
That was it.
Which is exactly what they're doing right now in Venezuela.
And it's the same, this just reminds me of the same pattern. You screw up the economy, you cause such stress that then we can have a coup and install somebody horrible.
Except one of the differences back then is that the Nixon administration was able to give a lot of money to the Chilean military, who actually built up them people for the coup. But the American government right now has not been able to actually sort of turn the military against Chavez.
That's right. That's one difference.
So that's a huge difference right there.
But it's a scary thing when the United States is free to meddle in these places. And this is like 46 years between the Chile coup and now.
One of the lessons that the American government learned, because I mentioned the book by the Chavez Code by Eva Gollinger, and one of the chapters in the book is called the Nicaraguan Chile template. And so what's going on is the American government learns lessons from history too. evil lessons. And what they did to Nicaragua and what they did to Chile, they're trying to do that in Venezuela right now.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard you talk about this. You know, we've met a couple times in the last few weeks and talked about Venezuela, and you've always made it very clear that Venezuela is a sovereign nation, and the U.S. or any other country for that matter has absolutely no right to go in and screw things up there.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things is that, in fact, I think the most important message that I'd like to get out today is that the United States has no right whatsoever to interfere militarily or have a coup in Venezuela or any other country.
Yeah.
In fact, it's only from literally a racist and a imperialist ideology that would actually sort of give American people the idea that we have a right to interfere in different countries. I mentioned before, John Pilger said if we succeed, this would be the 68th country that we've overthrown in the area, in the world.
Yeah.
And so it's something that we can't, we should not allow the American government to do. The American people should not let the American government do that.
But in American political life and really in the culture, Americans tend to feel a sense of entitlement to do that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, we're the beacon of liberty to the world, and whatever we do, we're doing for a righteous cause and stuff. We need to rein in that kind of egocentrism.
Yeah, what really makes it insane, and I think now, is that, you know, with Trump being president, most people in the country are anti-Trump. I mean, it's not like 100%, but it's about over 50%.
Yeah.
And people make fun of Trump. I watch CNN and NBC, MSNBC, and the other stuff, and also read a lot of the. And they will go to a program and talk about Trump being, you know, something with Russia, or Trump being a fool about something, and then they'll talk about President Trump says today something about Venezuela, as if we just sort of switched over from this fool to somebody who's a statesman.
Yeah.
And it's not true. The idea, if people actually think about it for more than sort of 10 seconds, the idea that Trump is concerned about the people of Latin America is an absolute absurdity.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't even care about Latin Americans who are American citizens, like in Puerto Rico. He doesn't care about Latin Americans who are from Mexico trying to cross the border. He doesn't care about Latin Americans who are Central Americans trying to cross the border. But suddenly he's concerned about the people of Venezuela. It's just not true.
Yeah, he doesn't even care about the ordinary people in the United States. He does things that screw us over in various. Take away, he and the Republicans want to take away 23 million people's health care. They want to do this and this, and the corruption, deliberately deregulating the Environmental Protection Agency in ways that they know will cause huge numbers of cancers.
And they just don't care.
Republicans cause cancer.
Right.
You know, we need to be able to say that out loud.
That's why the UN reporter actually said that the sanctions, in fact, are a war crime. In fact, I showed you a document from the UN that was passed in March of 2018, because if I'm saying that sanctions are actually a form of war crimes and wrong and illegal, one of the people who actually said that is the UN itself, the Human Rights Council, in March of 2018, said the sanctions against Venezuela are wrong. They're actually criminal activity. But of course, the American government doesn't pay attention to the UN. And one other quick example about that, every year there's a resolution in the UN about American foreign policy toward Cuba. And the vote this year was 189 to 2. Only two countries voted for the United States, and that was the United States and Israel. And the two countries abstained. So the entire world thinks that American foreign policy toward Latin America is basically insane. And in regards to Venezuela, approximately, from what I've been reading, approximately 50 countries have recognized Guaido, but those are mainly the old imperial countries of Europe and also the United States and Canada, and also some lackeys that we have in Latin America. But most of the world, 75% of the world, is actually recognizes the Maduro government. And plus the idea that we have no right whatsoever, even if everything the American government said about Maduro was true, and worse, the United States has no right whatsoever. And the only right we would have is actually attack Venezuela if we thought Venezuela was going to attack us, according to the UN, which of course nobody actually says that.
If we could see the shoe on the other foot, look at the the United States goes and overthrows some government because they say you're mistreating your people. Well, the United States has a long track record of mistreating our people of color, for example. Would that give Nigeria a right to come and, or Nigeria, an African country, would that give them a right to come and overthrow the U.S. government because the United States has been horribly mistreating black people? And Nigeria install a new Nigerian-friendly government that will enforce racial justice? Or if the United States has done other bad things. We're during the climate crisis. You know, Trump and the Republicans and the oil companies are just rapidly escalating the climate crisis, making things worse, even though scientists know that it's going to flood low-lying countries like Bangladesh. Maybe Bangladesh should come and overthrow the U.S. government to make them stop making the climate crisis worse. Otherwise, Bangladesh will be underwater.
And they will be underwater. So
yeah. So I mean, if you put the shoe on the other foot, Americans would say, no, we don't think Nigeria should overthrow us in order to improve our racial policies. No, we don't think Bangladesh should overthrow us in order to
Right.
you know.
Yeah, the United States actually has this, we have this illusion about our history. I mean, many people do. I mean, if you're African American, there aren't that many illusions. There are a few people. If you're a Native American, you have very few illusions because you've been destroyed. You have people. If you're Latin American, you don't have that many illusions anymore. And in fact, the white working class is actually becoming worse off, especially since the 1980s. So people should start losing their illusions, but also try to work for the better principles of democracy and freedom, and et cetera.
Right, and we could also, if we had time, we're a bit tight on time, but oil is a major factor. I know Trump, Venezuela has the largest amount of proven oil reserves of any nation on earth. Saudi Arabia is number 2, the United States is 10. Trump urged a war in Venezuela because he said, quote, they have all that oil and they're right on our back door, unquote.
Right. In fact, and Bolton said, like about 2 weeks ago, that we should have the American companies take over the oil in Venezuela. So it's really another war for oil. It's also a war to try to stop any type of independence movement in Latin America or other places around the world. And the Venezuelan oil tends to be somewhat dirty. It's not as clean as, say, Texas oil, Louisiana oil. So it takes more, they get less money for it, but they actually have a lot of oil. And so the United States is really trying to starve them from having any type of oil reserves. And one of the problems that exists in Venezuela is that the vast majority of its foreign sales have been in oil. So therefore they need to sell their oil.
That's their primary export, and oil prices in the last few years have been declining.
And that's actually and they went down really in 2014.
And and that's not because Maduro mismanaged anything. It's just the world price of oil declined. And Venezuela, that relies on oil for export income, ends up suffering for it.
So they have less money than they had before.
There's a couple other things here. I want to just mention that the media bias, the U.S. foreign policy, pretty much every aspect of U.S. foreign policy any place in the world, the U.S. mainstream media reporting just sort of does whatever the U.S. government says it wants to be. The media, even though they knew better about Iraq, they believed the Bush-Cheney lies about weapons of mass destruction and so forth. And in case after case after case, the media just is obedient to what the government wants. And they're doing this again.
The major media corporate, it's not a conspiracy, it's basically who owns the media.
It's corporate owned.
Corporately owned. And it's not just corporately owned individually, but people like General Electric and Westinghouse and groups like that. So whose interest is the media working in? I mean, Trump uses the word fake media because they don't like him as an individual, but that's not the major point. The point is actually that American people do not get accurate information of what's going on around the world. And they fall in line until it's too late. I mean, during the Vietnam War, they fell in line until Walter Cronkite visited and said, we're not going to win. And then, of course, they decided they wanted to get out of the war in Vietnam because we couldn't win. And the same thing with Iraq. After a while, the media says, after about 10 years, the media says maybe we should get out.
And the thing is that the peace movement at the time and progressive and alternative media were saying these lies are lies, and the mainstream media just would not touch it. They would not touch the truth. They fell in line behind the government propaganda.
In fact, if you take a look at MSNBC or CNN, and MSNBC tries to portray itself as the liberal one, but where is Code Pink? Where is Ralph Nader? Where are Elijah, for example, Cummings? Where are these people? Where are these voices that actually talk, who are actually against the war? Where is Pramila Jayapal? She's actually signed on a resolution. Where is OAC on the national media to give a 15-minute talk about what's going on?
And at the end, with the TV programs that I do here, I also type up a very thorough summary of what we said, and I post that to my blog along with a link for watching this interview. And at the end of that very thorough summary that I'll post to my blog, there will be a list of a whole lot of good resources, some that you suggested and some that I've suggested, and so people can see some links to find out. We don't have time to name them all here, but the resources do exist.
Yeah, they do
people need to
exist.
seek them out. So I want to mention that Congress has been failing us too. There are a few Congress members that oppose Trump's interference in Venezuela, but nearly all members of Congress are either supporting the U.S. meddling or are silent. Oh, and here's the thing from Cantwell. Her reply when I emailed her email reply was, "Thank you for contacting me regarding the leadership dispute in Venezuela." That was her quotation. And it's not a leadership dispute; it's a coup. It's a coup. There is, as of now, in March 14, when we taped this program, H.R. 1004 and S.J. Res 11 would prevent U.S. intervention there without Congress's approval. We need to have Congress have some backbone about War Powers Act and so forth.
There's about 40-some Congress people have signed on to that, but I did not see Congressman Heck's name on there, so people should actually try to contact him.
Yeah, he's really, really timid about standing up for peace on almost every issue. One of the things that you mentioned when we were on the phone to prepare for this interview, and that I've mentioned before when I've done programs about immigration, is that this immigration crisis that we're having comes largely from previous U.S. policies toward Latin America, where the United States has been funding death squads and supporting nasty, horrible stuff in Central America. NAFTA made it impossible for farmers to earn a living. So these people have to come to the U.S. and then we won't let them in.
Yeah, in fact, I wrote an article about 2 months ago that's on counterpunch.org. So it's counterpunch.org. So if you type, go to counterpunch.org and type my last name, a bunch of articles that come up that I've written. And this one's about migration, with the children and the cages, et cetera. And I point out that the reason that people are coming, especially Central Americans, more than Mexicans, the reason Central Americans are coming because of the economic conditions that were imposed on Central America from the 1980s, 1990s, and people are getting very, very desperate. And so it caused all these problems. And this is actually an important lesson for, and I also put some possible solutions of how we could solve that problem. We could take part of the military budget, say about 5–10% of the budget, which is $700 billion, take about $70 billion, and rebuild these economies. And then people won't want to come up here, just like the Marshall Plan of Europe in the world, at the end of World War II. And so there are solutions, and one of the problems with Venezuela right now, if the United States actually goes in militarily, it's not just what's going to happen this week or this month or this year. It's going to be the next 5, 10, 20 years. The same things that's going on right now because of the conditions that exist in Central America.
And with the Vietnam War, we ended up welcoming in refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia and so forth because we made it impossible for them to live there. And we're going to do that in more places. We're doing that in the Middle East, Syria, and all. I mean, we're causing all kinds of problems in so many places, and then we don't. I wrote a thing a while back saying that we should have Congress pass a law prohibiting the United States from doing any intervention in any other country unless we commit in advance that we will accept all the refugees that we cause.
From the area.
That would have a deterrent effect on U.S. Militarism. There is opposition to these policies in the U.S., and there is opposition to these policies elsewhere in the world. So people need to know that where it's not just Larry and Glenn spouting off.
Well, in fact, this is March 14th, but on the 16th there's going to be International Day of actually protests around the world and around the United States, including one here in Olympia, but it'll probably be too late for the people watching right now.
The program will debut in April.
And there's another one on March 30th, and there'll be more stuff going on. And so all these protests are going on, and also all this activity is going on around the world. Because when I take a look at internet searches, I take a look at England and Ireland and Europe and other places. All this stuff is going on around the world. And also there are people who are coming up with possible solutions. In fact, it would not cost the United States anything to actually sort of leave Venezuela alone. if, like we talked earlier about the $25 billion that's actually being robbed from Venezuela because of the sanctions, if Venezuela, the sanctions were taken off, which is the number one thing in my view, then Venezuela would have its own money to do what it wants for the people of Venezuela. So it's not that what comes out of our pocket. It's actually let them sort of do what they want to do.
Right. They would be able to use their own money to solve the problems.
Right.
And not have us cause problems and then punish the people in various ways. You had mentioned a moment ago, and I'm glad you mentioned solutions because there are some. You had mentioned a moment ago something like a Marshall Plan to do this. You also active with Olympia's Venezuelan Anti-Intervention Coalition,
Right.
and there's a 4-point plan that says no to all U.S. military intervention in Venezuela, and all sanctions against Venezuela. Third one is support providing food and medical aid to Venezuela through the United Nations, so it's done in a neutral, impartial way, and the United States isn't getting our hooks into it. And the fourth one is support negotiations between Venezuela's elected government and the opposition. There really is quite a polarized nation, and if they're going to solve the problems, neutral people, not the U.S., can help them work out.
In fact, Maduro has offered to actually negotiate, but the American government and Guaido said they don't want to negotiate.
Yeah, so
they're actually saying we refuse to talk to you.
Yeah.
Except the United States government, again, is lying about that, because I know that Elliott Abrams, in fact, has met with the Venezuelan ambassador in Washington, D.C., sort of the foreign minister when he was up there in New York City. So Abrams actually negotiating.
Yeah, well, and commonly this is what happens is a country that's having a dispute, it could be a civil war or a dispute with a neighbor, say, oh, we can't talk to them because they're so evil. And actually when the conflicts get solved or the wars end, it's because they were actually doing conversation by this.
Right.
Helena Meyer Knapp from Olympia wrote a book on exactly that, and she had like 5 or 6 case studies, Northern Ireland and South Africa, where Nelson Mandela was actually talking with the de Klerk government and so forth. And she has like 5 or 6 case studies where that's exactly what happened, is people who said, oh, we can't talk to them, actually were, and that's how you solve the problems, you talk.
Yeah, the only way these issues become solved, either a government like the United States tries to kill everybody, like in Vietnam, or they talk to people. And talking to people is actually much more effective.
And one of the scary things about Bolton, Trump's national security advisor, is that Bolton hates diplomacy.
Right.
He really opposes diplomacy. He thinks you got to go and just overthrow those places.
Yeah, he's the kind of, him and Abrams are literally the kind of people who would be serving the Third Reich in Germany in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm not exaggerating. People should take a look at their records.
That exactly is where they're at. Ordinary American people can help. We need to push the government. We need to demand better news coverage. We need to seek out the alternative coverage that does provide accuracy. And there are some good sources of information that I mentioned I'll post to my blog at the end of the thorough summary about what we said during this conversation. Is there anything else that you would recommend that we do, and then we'll wrap this thing up in just a couple of minutes?
Yeah, just to be informed. I mean, I get the regular paper. I get the New York Times, the Seattle Times, and the Olympian delivered every day. So I get the official lies, what I call it, delivered to my door. And then I got to go do some more research. And so there is plenty of information out there, but we have to look for it. The two I've been looking at very recently is called VenezuelaAnalysis.com, VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And also, if you want to watch videos, short videos on YouTube, there's the Gray Zone actually has some good 5-minute videos.
Okay.
And so you can actually, it's like watching the news, and the Real News Network also. There is places available. There are ways to get information. So it's not impossible to find out what's going on.
Right. And I will mention, I'm glad you mentioned VenezuelaAnalysis.com. We'll mention that on the screen. And also, when we were on the phone talking, you mentioned a source that I've been reading also, the Alliance for Global Justice, www.afgz.org, and then they have an activist toolkit regarding Venezuela, and we'll have the link to that on the screen, and I'll post that on my blog so people don't have to rapidly write.
We are not helpless. We were not helpless during Vietnam. We were not helpless during the Iraq War, and we're not helpless now.
Yeah, we can solve these problems. And part of what we need to do is not just feel at the mercy of these tyrants trying to dominate us, but we can empower ourselves to solve these problems. So I want to thank Larry Mosqueda for sharing his knowledge and insights with us during this hour. I want to thank the people who've been watching our interview. In a democracy, ordinary people must take responsibility to be in charge, just like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the other people who created our nation insisted, we the people are the rightful leaders. We create governments to serve our interests. Governments need our wisdom and our guidance. When they screw up, we need to set them right again. Ordinary people have better values than those that run our government and our economy. Our best values would prevent any U.S. harm to Venezuela's economy or sovereignty or people. Our best values would protect human rights for people in Latin America and in the U.S. and in the rest of the world. So I urge people to practice our best values, hold our government accountable, hold our media accountable. I do offer workshops in nonviolent grassroots organizing to strengthen people's abilities to function better and more actively in a free society. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. You can also phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Thanks.